You are listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network.
Welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that's always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here are your hosts, Mark Dailey and Kevin Laramée.
Hello and welcome to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One. Mark Dailey here, welcoming you on board for the first show of 2019. Happy New Year. I hope wherever you are, you had a safe and enjoyable and wonderful holiday, and happy 2019. Wishing you all the best for a successful, prosperous, and healthy new year. I don't know about you guys, but I took almost 2 weeks off of work. It's a little bit slower in the profession that I'm in, at my 9-to-5 job, and it was a really welcome rest. And we went back to work on Wednesday, on January 2nd. And I'll be honest with you, the first couple of days back at the grind has been a little bit difficult. I really enjoyed my time off. But yes, so what comes after January 2nd is January 3rd. And wishing a very happy birthday to the one and only 7-time world champion Michael Schumacher. And of course, Michael still recovering from that horrible injury he suffered 5 years ago, if you can believe it, skiing. But tributes coming in all over the world from fans and motor racing drivers and everybody that knew or admired or watched Michael Schumacher. Truly one of a kind. I'm not really going to add anything more to the top 10 Michael Schumacher moments. I mean, there's plenty of great material out there if you just hop online. I'm going to instead share a personal memory, or a couple of them anyways, before we get into the show itself. And I must admit that when Schumacher first burst onto the scene in the mid 90s with Jordan at the Belgian Grand Prix, and then quite quickly was snapped up and moved over to Benetton. I took a long time to warm up to him, to be quite honest. Several episodes ago, we did was our 5 most memorable moments in Formula One, and one of those that I shared was the 1995 season finale at the Australian Grand Prix when he collided with Damon Hill and knocked Hill out of the race, and knocked both of them out of the race. But he's the one that claimed the world championship at that time. I was a big Damon Hill fan at the time, and it took me a long time to get over that one, honestly, but I did over time really come to appreciate the talent and the dedication, and just how Schumacher really helped raise the bar in Formula One, just the professionalism and just the amazing talent that he really was. And my very first Grand Prix that I went to was at the 2001 European Grand Prix, held at the Nürburgring, and that's way back on the 24th of June in 2001, and doesn't seem like a long time ago, but it was. Anyways, it was the 9th race of that season, and Schumacher was he started on pole. But what really struck me, I mean, obviously, other than the race itself and seeing Formula One up close and personal for the very first time, was on the warm-up lap. Schumacher's car, I believe it was actually the spare car, actually failed on him, and we were sitting in the stands. If you're familiar with the Nürburgring, we were sitting in the horseshoe-shaped stands at the Dunlop curve, which is the big hairpin down at the bottom of the track, which is a phenomenal place to watch a Formula One race, or probably motorsports in general. You watch the cars come down the hill at a very high rate of speed. They slam on their brakes and slow down quite substantially as they go through the hairpin, through the corner, and then quite quickly back onto the accelerator as they exit the corner, and then take off up the hill into a very fast left-hand corner. But anyways, on the formation lap, Schumi came down, his car failed, and there was a bit of panic. And of course, this is at the height, 2001 is when they were really getting on a roll, Schumi and Ferrari. And of course, the being in Germany, and regardless, it was the European Grand Prix or not. It was still in Germany. The stands were absolutely packed with German Schumacher and Ferrari fans. There was just literally a sea of red. I mean, the atmosphere there was absolutely brilliant. It was something I'll never forget. The whole spectacle and the whole experience was just amazing. But I think as soon as his car stopped and he climbed out of the cockpit, I think 110,000 fans got to their feet and hearts stopped. Anyways, Schumi hopped on the back of a scooter and was quickly ferried back to the pits, where he hopped back into his car and was able to take the grid and eventually won the race. Juan Pablo Montoya was second in the Williams, and David Coulthard finished third in that race in a McLaren. And when was the last time that we could say we saw a Ferrari, a Williams, and a McLaren on the top three steps of the podium? Obviously, we see Ferrari there quite often nowadays, but it seems like a long time ago when we saw Williams and McLaren on the top couple of steps of the podium. Anyways, of the current drivers, Lewis Hamilton himself, a five-time world champion, obviously, and now hunting down Schumacher's got him in the sights. He's got Schumi leads the way with 91 career Grand Prix victories and 7 world championships, and you just have to wonder how long it's going to be if and when Lewis will catch and perhaps surpass and become the greatest driver, winningest driver of all time. He's already broken all the records for pole positions that were held by the greats like Senna and Schumacher, and well, I mean, if the last 5 years have been anything to go by, it certainly doesn't seem to be too much of a stretch of the imagination that Lewis definitely has a very, very good chance to equal Schumacher's records. Anyways, Lewis had posted on Instagram, and I'll just read it out quickly. He said, "Wishing you a happy birthday, Michael, 50 years of life and a legacy that will last forever. What an honor it is to say I have raced with you. You've always been a true inspiration to me and the entire world. Keep fighting, champ." So there you go. Nice, a very classy social media post by Lewis Hamilton, and of course we wish Schumacher and his family all our very best wishes here, and hope that he's recovering well, and of course we hope to see him back one day. We'll wait and see if that happens. Anyways, let's get into the show itself now. Well, the first thing I want to touch on is an article that was on ESPN earlier this week, and it sort of encapsulates a couple of things that or several topics that we've been talking about the last several weeks, and I believe that this one was done by Nate Saunders, the F1 associate editor over at ESPN, and I think it's really good. I mean, he summarized it into about half a dozen points, and I think that well, several of them that I know we've talked about for sure. Anyways, the points that he touched on were Vettel versus Leclerc, 6 for Lewis and Mercedes, more overtaking. How competitive will Red Bull be with Honda? Has Ricciardo made a terrible mistake? And what if Fernando Alonso McLaren win the Indy 500? Well, where do you want to start with all of those? Obviously, I think those are some very, very good points that he brings up. And well, Vettel versus Leclerc, that's definitely going to be a very, very intriguing and interesting battle that we're going to see unfolding. I would think basically right from the beginning of the season. It's a transitional year for Ferrari because obviously they've had a very stable partnership with Vettel and Raikkonen over the past couple of years, and Leclerc, being the, well, I wouldn't say, well, I guess he is a little bit of the odd, I wouldn't say he's the odd man out. I'd say he's the odd exception in the fact that historically Ferrari has never really gone with the younger drivers. But I mean, Charles has acquitted himself very, very well in the limited amount of time that he's been in Formula One. And to make a jump from a team like Sauber to one of the biggest teams in the sport and one of the most storied racing marks anywhere in the entire world is, it's a big move, and we'll have to wait and see whether or not he can live up to the expectations and live up to the pressure that obviously comes with driving for Ferrari, and how he'll be able to challenge Sebastian Vettel. Now, this is also a very interesting year for Sebastian, because we talked about 2019 being a very pivotal, and a make or break season for Valtteri Bottas over at Mercedes. And I almost wonder if, to a certain extent, it might be the same for Sebastian Vettel. I mean, he's obviously had a very, very good career so far. I mean, he started out with Toro Rosso, of course, went to Red Bull, won 4 world championships over there, which is obviously that's a fantastic achievement, and then made the big move to Ferrari to try and help them reclaim the glory and get back to winning championships over there. And well, obviously it hasn't worked out just yet, but the interesting thing I think it's going to be the real dynamic between Vettel and Leclerc is, how does Vettel bounce back after 2018? I mean, there was no doubt that he probably should have won the world championship last year. The car, the SF71H that Ferrari fielded in 2018 certainly was a very good car, was at least equal to the Mercedes. And well, I think it's a little bit difficult to say which car was better, because I think that each one of them were very well suited, or better suited to certain tracks than the other car was at certain times of the year, and that certainly showed. But obviously, Vettel did a lot of things repeatedly that very good racing drivers don't repeatedly do. And we saw that so many times. We saw it at Baku. We saw it at the French Grand Prix. We saw it at Monza, and just keep on going. Japan. Every time it seemed there was that something could go wrong, it would go wrong. And I'm not specifically talking about the car, but it just seemed that the mental battle, the mental side of the game, that was really his Achilles heel last year. So he's really going to have to bounce back from that. And he's got a very, very competent teammate. Not that Raikkonen wasn't competent, but I think that Kimi was just that little bit slower than Sebastian. I think Sebastian was just naturally has that little bit extra speed when compared to Kimi. And I think that maybe he wasn't really pushed as hard as perhaps he might have been by another driver. Obviously, late in the season, we saw that situation turn around. We saw Raikkonen win the U.S. Grand Prix at the Circuit of Americas late in the year, and certainly we saw Brazil and some of the other tracks that he was the faster of the two Ferraris. But I think at that point, obviously, the season was over. I think that mentally, Sebastian Vettel was done at that point. But I kind of go back and think as to what went on at Vettel's last year at Red Bull in 2014, when he was partnered with Danny Ricciardo. And actually, I think he finished 5th in the World Championship that year, if I remember correctly or incorrectly. Anyways, he did finish 2nd to Ricciardo, who was still a bit of an up-and-comer at the time. Obviously, he's had a very successful career at Red Bull now that he's done there and off to Renault. But that year, certainly, he was better than Sebastian Vettel. And so it'll be interesting to see if that situation repeats itself between Vettel and Leclerc this year. All right, moving along. So 6 for Lewis and Mercedes. Sure, why not? Yeah, I know it's maybe a little bit too simple just to maybe distill it down into maybe just a couple of thoughts here, but they really have been an amazing story over the past 5 years. Mercedes obviously coming into the V6 turbo hybrid era in 2014 were streets ahead of everyone else. Not only did they have the best engines, they had the best drivers, they had the best cars, and it's more or less been that way every year since. We've seen that gap close, obviously, with Ferrari. They've been a regular and a competitor, and have really challenged them, and of course have won quite a number of races themselves. Obviously, nowhere quite as many as the Silver Arrows, but Red Bull too has put their best efforts forward as well, and have managed to win quite a few races between Ricciardo and Max Verstappen. But they really are the gold standard in Formula One, and unless things change, it how would you bet against them? I'm certainly not a man brave enough to do it, and certainly they are the benchmark in Formula One. And you would have to think that it's going to be more or less the same this year in 2019. That they're going to be the team to beat and the team to chase. So we'll just have to see how they get it right, or don't get it right, if that might be the case, once we get to Melbourne in a couple of months. And if I'm not mistaken, today being January 3rd, I did the math, and I believe we're 72 days away from the first Grand Prix in Australia. And, well, okay, I'm trying to be optimistic, but geez, 72 days, 73 days, whatever it is, it's still a hell of a long time, but I guess it'll be here before we really realize it, and that's usually the case. Okay, more overtaking, and of course, this comes down to the regulations that were really pushed through last year, and well, what they're doing is that they've made some small but possibly important changes to the cars for this year, and they've simplified the front wings and made wider, deeper rear wings, which is basically, let's just simplify it, that these changes that they've made to the wings are to reduce the turbulence, air behind the cars, and hopefully by doing so that the cars will be able to get closer together, and thereby setting up more opportunities to pass one another. So whether or not that actually works, they did do a bunch of testing and simulation before that, and they really rushed it through. I guess it was about a third of the way through the season. There are some agreements and rules that they can do so, but they did have input from the teams, and everybody seemed fairly positive about it at the time. There have been some comments come out since regarding whether or not these changes will actually make any difference. So I guess that the proof will be in the pudding. It will obviously be told once the cars get on the track all at the same time, and they're actually racing each other in a real life Grand Prix rather than in computer land in a simulation somewhere. And of course, testing is just a way for them to shake down the cars and get prepared for the season. So we'll have to wait those 72 days. It's as simple as that. I mean, Melbourne really isn't the best track for overtaking. That might not be the best indication, or who knows, perhaps if they have gotten it right and we see a lot of overtaking at a track that has traditionally been quite dull at times in terms of overtaking on the track. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people will go on about the 2018 race when Sebastian Vettel managed to pass Lewis Hamilton in the pits under a virtual safety car to win the race. That was obviously a bit of a black mark and a bit of obviously a bit of a low point for Formula One. I've never been a big fan of cars passing another car in the pits for the lead, or, get the whole thing with the overcut and the undercut. I always like to see it, two cars on the track and two drivers fighting it out for position. But out of all of those situations, definitely Vettel passing under the VSC was definitely no bueno. And we'll see. Again, that's another question that's completely open for next year. Anyways, well, the Red Bull items, Red Bull, will they be competitive with Honda? That's a great question. Obviously, Honda's been a lot more reliable this year, and I think they scored more points with Toro Rosso in 2018 than they did the previous couple of years combined with McLaren. So that was obviously a big step forward, and their reliability was much improved. I believe that last year between Brendan Hartley and Pierre Gasly, that there was only 3 retirements out of the entire year that were directly attributed to Honda and their reliability themselves. So obviously big progress. Earlier this year, they were saying that their benchmark for 2019 is to provide them with an engine that was at least give them a season or performance and reliability that was equal to, if not better than, what they were getting from Renault this year. So it obviously will be a bit of a transition year, but the other benefit, of course, is that Red Bull has had a year of data from having those Honda engines in their junior team, which is Toro Rosso, of course. So they should be well prepared. And how that turns out, well, If you're McLaren, maybe you're hoping maybe it's not going to turn out so great, considering how messy and expensive that divorce from Honda was. But that being a completely different rabbit hole to go down. The thing is that I've always said that Honda's proven it in Formula One in the past. I mean, you go back to the 80s and the 90s. I mean, that McLaren Honda partnership was something special, and the same with the Williams Honda in the late 1980s. So they've done it before, but I think that they came to the game a little bit too late, and where the other engine manufacturers had several years of development and design and research go into these turbo hybrid engines, Honda did not, and had to accelerate their program and came in obviously well off the mark compared to everyone else, and they and McLaren suffered for that. And whether or not they've caught up now, well, that's a great question. I mean, we obviously saw some promising moments last year with Toro Rosso, so we'll have to see whether or not that continues for this year. And has Danny Ricciardo made a terrible mistake moving to Renault for next year? Well, again, that's going to be another wait and see approach since Renault took over the Lotus team a couple of years ago and embarked on this short to midterm project. I think they said they wanted to be a competitive, excuse me, one of the top teams, competitive teams winning races within 5 years. So we're getting close to that now, and the steps obviously in the first year was they were small, but again, that was really a rebranded Lotus with Renault livery, and it had a Renault engine in it and everything like that. And we've seen them improve definitely each and every year. And I think 2018 was a bit disappointing. I really expected a bigger step forward from them last year, and they had their moments, but definitely they've sort of become obviously not a back of the pack team, but they're a middle of the pack team. So whether they can really make that step forward is that's a $64,000 question. I mean, they obviously have the talent, they have the knowledge, they have the experience, they've got the backing. I mean, Renault Nissan is a major car manufacturer, and they have the means and the opportunity to do it. Whether or not they can put all the puzzle pieces into place and actually get it all to line up and actually pull it off, well, that's another question. And that's sort of dependent, or at least for Danny Ricciardo, well, that will really, I guess, be what really seals and answers that question, as whether or not has he made a terrible mistake. And I don't really blame him for or fault him from moving from Red Bull, because I think obviously that is Max Verstappen's team now. He's the guy of the future. He's a potential world champion. He's got all the attributes, and he certainly turned his season around in 2018 after starting out and not having a very good start, struggling through the first half dozen races, and then putting it into the wall and qualifying at Monaco. But after that, he got his head on straight, and starting in Canada, we saw a different Max Verstappen. We saw a more mature, a more patient, a much more complete, and a much better Max Verstappen. And I think obviously that the team is, it's hard to say whether or not it's built around him, but it's definitely a team that's focused on him, is perhaps the best way to put it. And even though Ricciardo's won more races there at Red Bull compared to Max Verstappen, I think in the long term that they're hedging their bets to go with Max. And I think Ricciardo maybe at just realizing that wanted to go somewhere else where the focus is going to be more on him. And that seems to me to be a pretty good partnership at Renault with Ricciardo and Nico Hülkenberg. And who knows? Let's see whether or not they can pull it off. I mean, Renault is only one of a couple of teams that design and build their own cars and engines. The other two being Ferrari and Mercedes, obviously. So that'll be a really interesting situation to watch over the course of the next year, and if not the next couple of years. And then finally, just what we'll close out this discussion with Alonso McLaren winning the Indy 500. Well, It would be amazing. I mean, Fernando, great racer, double world champion, has done a lot in Formula One, burnt a lot of bridges in Formula One, stirred up a lot of controversy in Formula One, and left Formula One with a lot of unanswered questions and a lot of what ifs. But he, of course, is on this quest to claim motorsport's unofficial triple crown, being Monaco, Le Mans, and the 500. Obviously, he's won Monaco, he's won Le Mans now, which he did with Toyota last year. So it's just the 500 that he needs to win, and he went there, of course, in 2017, did very well, got about, I don't know, it was more than 3/4 of the way through before his car expired and his engine blew, and you could tell that as much as he enjoyed that experience, that was an opportunity missed, because I mean he was definitely in the mix of the guys that had a shot to win it that year. But the big question, of course, is, well, as cool as it is to see McLaren and Alonso at the Indy 500 next year, the big question is, are they really spreading their attention away from where it needs to be? I mean, obviously they've really struggled in Formula One. And I think the interesting thing is, and there were a couple of stories that and opinion pieces that have been floating around the last 10 days, 2 weeks or so, that have addressed this topic, and we've talked about it too in the past, over the past year or so, is that since they switched from Honda to Renault, that it just exposed the fact that the car that they had last year just was not as good as they'd been saying it was, because when they were having all those problems with Honda, they kept saying, well, you know, it's the car. We've got one of the best chassis, one of the best cars on the entire grid, and it's all Honda. It's not us. And then, you know, lo and behold, they switched to Renault, and honestly, there wasn't really that much of a change. And after they ran the first several races and they got to Spain, when you usually see the first round of upgrades be brought in and introduced by all the teams to the cars, the upgrade that McLaren introduced really didn't do a lot, and really didn't make that much of a difference to their season. So, like I say, it's great to see. Whether or not it's going to be too much of a distraction, probably not. I mean, the Indy operation is obviously going to be separate from Formula One, and who knows? On the flip side, if they can pull it off, maybe it's that motivation, maybe that inspiration that they need to really to get back on top and win again. And Zak Brown, the CEO, the big head honcho over at McLaren, he said that they want to be targeting championships within the next 5 years, and he's really convinced that the team is really on the real, or on the right path to get back at the front of the grid. But he's not really making too many commitments about what they're going to what they're setting in terms of goals and achievements and results for the coming year. But, you know, honestly, I think even though it's a big organization at McLaren, and they've been in a little bit of a no man's land and regressing over the past several seasons. I mean, that's just fact. I mean, it's been tough to watch and sad to see another one of these great Formula One teams struggling like they have. But if anything, I feel a little bit more confident if I'm a fan of McLaren with Zak Brown at the helm there. I just kind of get the feeling he's one of these guys that knows and is able to get the job done. He certainly has his work cut out for them, and it's going to be, I think, an interesting situation for them. I mean, they've completely changed things up again. They got new drivers for next year, and well, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there definitely is more pressure on McLaren to design and build a good car next year, because we know that the Renault is a decent engine, because we saw Red Bull last year win in the races several times, and won especially the Mexican Grand Prix, where they won a race where I don't think anybody expected them to do so. I mean, that Renault engine had lots of power compared to the Ferrari and the Mercedes in the thin, rarefied, or the thinner atmosphere of Mexico City, and they were dominant. So we know in certain circumstances and certain situations that Renault engine is going to have lots of power, whether or not they can they can get more power and close the gap to Mercedes and McLaren, and have that power and that competitive edge each and every race. That's obviously their goal, but that's obviously what puts the pressure on McLaren as well, and obviously on Renault too. But 5 years, that seems like a bit of a lofty goal, but again, 5 years in Formula One is a very, very long time. And when you think about it, under these current set of regulations, we're going into 2019 and 2020, and then of course everything is going to change in 2021, and that, of course, is still hasn't been completely finalized. Chase Carey and the top guy over at Liberty Media, the owners of Formula One, met with all the respective teams after the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix back in November. There seems to be a fair amount of positivity, at least what you've heard publicly, that there is some optimism in the direction that they want to go. And well, we'll wait and see what those changes are and how they manage to push those through, because that's going to be another difficult thing. And that was also another point that Brown had actually made, was whether or not they're able to really push through these changes. And well, Formula One is so political, and there are so many vested interests. And well, are they going to be able to get all these changes through, and how much of a struggle is going to be? That will unfold over time. Okay, well, sorry about this, guys. I know I'm kind of jumping around a little bit here, but it's first show of the year, and there has been quite a bit of news that's kind of popped up over the past couple of weeks. So my notes kind of reflect that. I'm afraid. So I want to just talk again briefly about. We'll stay on the Honda theme that we've been talking about, and it's been interesting as well that over the past couple of last year, there was quite a number of the Formula One teams expressed, I guess, their surprise in the fact that the Toro Rosso had decided to go and choose the rival Honda engines, and the words that they used, that they were, quote, totally crazy. And I guess it looked like it at the time, way back at the end of 2017, when it was getting pretty messy, obviously, with McLaren and Honda, and I think Bernie Ecclestone really wanted to keep them in, and there was a real push to keep them in the sport. So there was that whole complicated deal, and the way that the Renault engines went to McLaren, and Sainz went from Toro Rosso to Renault for a loan, and all these different things going on. But sure, they certainly they did take a risk in doing it, but I think obviously it has worked out, especially, well, I think it's at least to put Red Bull in a very good position, because they were able to evaluate the engine data from both the Honda engines in their junior team at Toro Rosso, and the Renault engines in their own cars at Red Bull Racing, and really compare them apples and apples and oranges and oranges. And obviously they decided that they were apples and oranges, to make this a little bit confusing. And they figured that the Honda engine has more potential. So I think obviously that, well, at least in my mind, that when Toro Rosso ended up with the Honda engines, to me, that seemed like, at the time, I thought it was interesting. I think maybe even Sauber at that point was mentioned in that conversation, that there was some interest there, or maybe some desire or some suggestion that they could end up powering Sauber for 2018. Obviously, that didn't happen, and they stuck with Ferrari engines. Fortunately for them, they had engines that were the current spec rather than a previous year's spec, as they had the year before. But for me, just to go back to Toro Rosso, that wasn't as a big of an eye-opener that they decided to choose Honda as it was when Red Bull decided to. And they really took their time. I mean, Renault had set a deadline. I think it was roughly around the Canadian Grand Prix, so that would have been back late spring, early summer last year, somewhere in June, I think it was. And Red Bull, I think, went past that deadline, and I think they kind of made their announcement somewhere at the end of June, maybe into the beginning of July. But it seems that they've really taken their time, and they've really did all their homework before making that decision. And also, just sticking at Toro Rosso, McLaren-bound James Key, who was the technical director at Toro Rosso, he won't be replaced. There's going to be more of cooperation between Red Bull Racing and Toro Rosso. There'll be more use of common parts, and of course that gets into the that whole debate that we've seen over the past couple of years as to whether or not that the Haas is a clone of the Ferrari, and the whole thing about the standardized parts and how many unique parts have to be designed and built by each team. But anyways, there's going to be more, synergy, more cooperation between the two Red Bull teams, and therefore Key will not be replaced at Toro Rosso. And this was a bit of a real mind boggler, and just again a reminder of a bit of the craziness of Formula One. But between Pierre Gasly and Brendan Hartley, Toro Rosso spent over €2 million. Almost didn't get it out there, but they spent almost €2 million in crash damage in 2018. And that is just absolutely a phenomenal sum when you think about it. I mean, there was a number of crashes between them. And there was, one was the heavy crash between Gasly and Roman Grosjean at Barcelona, which was obviously Grosjean's fault when he lost the car, and then decided to just, I don't know what he decided to do. Anyways, he just put the power down and just made a big smoke screen and collected, not just Gasly, he got Nico Hülkenberg in the Renault, and I think one other car was involved in it as well. So there was that. There was the big crash between Lance Stroll and Hartley at the opening lap at Montreal, and then Hartley had a massive crash in free practice at the British Grand Prix. So all those things add up, and that is just, to me, that is just an absolutely phenomenal and mind-blowing amount of money. All right. Well, just talking about the 2019 rules again. We were talking a little bit earlier just about the redesigned, simplified front wings, and the bigger and wider, deeper rear wings are going to be the focus of the rules. And Paddy Lowe, the chief technical officer at Williams, he believes that the rules will be a little bit more black and white and less of an opportunity for teams to exploit loopholes and gray areas, specifically like we saw way back in 2009, which is amazing to think about. It was the one and only year of the Braun Grand Prix, and of course they were the ones that really pioneered that double diffuser, and of course they use that to a very, very big advantage, especially the opening part of that season. I think they really caught everybody off guard, and Toyota and Williams, they deployed the same system as well. And but 10 years on, Paddy Lowe feels that it's unlikely there will be a similar repeat of the rules and the technical specifications for Formula One. Whether or not that is true, and whether or not it leads to more overtaking, we'll find out in a couple of months, obviously. And sticking with Williams, they reached what they called the quote bottom of the trench in 2018. And well, we talked a little bit earlier about how much McLaren has regressed in over the past several seasons. I can't believe, and I apologize for this. I think I've said this each and every week, but as somebody that grew up with the dominance of Williams with Honda engines, and then Renaults, and then even enjoyed success even in the early 2000s with the BMW. It's just amazing to me how far they've fallen in a very, very, relatively very, very short period of time. I mean, if you go back even just a couple of years, I mean, they were, I guess you could say they had a legitimate shout to be one of the best of the rest teams. I mean, when they came into the turbo hybrid era, they were doing pretty good. I mean, they had a good pairing of drivers with Felipe Massa and Valtteri Bottas. They had a good car, but the car that they designed for this past season, the FW41, was just too technically and radically different than everyone else, and they paid for it big time. I mean, they were just they were embarrassing at times for a team that has the resources and the pedigree and the experience that they have, and over 4 decades in Formula One, to see them struggle and finish 10th, which is dead last in the constructors, is just, it's really, really sad. I mean, there's no other way to put it other than the fact that that was a disastrous season for them. I mean, they had a fundamentally flawed car, and I think it was difficult for the two youngsters they had driving it, Lance Stroll and Sergei Sirotkin. I think they got 7 points between them, but more than that, obviously the car that did not perform as they wanted and did not live up to expectations. And again, this is, I guess, a limited criticism of those two guys. But when you have limited experience in Formula One, when you do with two very young drivers like that, both in their early 20s, and you have a car that is so fundamentally different and a big departure in your previous ethos and your design principles, and how are you really going to get that car really dialed in and get the feedback from guys that might be good, talented racing drivers, but just don't have the experience in Formula One to maybe give the engineers the most, well, I guess what's the best way to put it? The most accurate feedback of what the car is actually doing and what they can do to maybe improve upon it. But I think they've got to do, and I'm sure they are, doing a lot of soul searching and internal examination, and hopefully put the situation right, because it is just not a good thing to see when you look at all the amount of championships that they've won, as both in the drivers and constructors championships over the decades, to see them languishing at the back and being off of the pace by a huge margin at times, like we saw last year, is just a terrible look for them. And it's going to be something, well, I don't know how long they can, it's going to take for them to turn it around. I mean, if McLaren and Zak Brown are saying that they're targeting 5 years before they're competitive again, so say 2023, 2024, somewhere in that time frame, that seems like a long way down the road to me, especially in the world of Formula One. So whatever Williams is going to do, they certainly have their work cut out for them. And talking about looking down the road into the future, Formula One actually wants to get rid of grid penalties, for 2021, which I think is actually an excellent idea. I know that they were put into place to really penalize teams and kind of really use it as a deterrent and a motivating factor, if you want to call it that, when it comes to things like engines and gearboxes and replacing expensive parts and things like that. But when you saw some of the mushrooming grid penalties, and you look at some of the ridiculous grid penalties that you see, something like 50 grid places in some cases that we saw over the past couple of years, when you have to switch out this component or that component in a gearbox or a complete new engine or an MGUH or an MGUK, whatever it might be. It just got a little bit silly when there's only 20 cars or 22 cars on the grid. Like, what's the point of giving a guy a 50 grid place penalty? I mean, he doesn't even actually have to get into the car to go qualifying, because, he's just not going to get any further up. I mean, he's still going to be dead last. So they're looking at some different alternatives, which it could affect their free practice running. They're looking about adding ballast to the car, making it heavier, and all these things just to increase the lap time and maybe penalize them that way, rather than just tagging on this ridiculously huge grid penalty and just sending somebody to the back of the grid. So if they can do that and increase the lap times and lower the grid position through other ways, then hey, I'm all for it. Disable the DRS, whatever it might be. I think that's a better alternative. So I'll look forward to see what they're going to come up to. And again, I think this also goes back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier about about that Zak Brown from McLaren was saying that Formula One has to ignore what he calls the pushback and fix the broken model. And certainly there will be resistance from teams, especially when it comes to I think obviously the redistribution of the wealth and the proposed budget cap and things like that. But of course, I guess if you're one of the big teams and you're used to winning all that that prize money, and then of course Ferrari gets that historical constructor, something like that, some special payment. I mean, obviously they've been there basically right from the very beginning, and of course their position within Formula One is unique, but still they're pulling in a lot of money in general as a sport, and there's got to be a way to distribute it fairly among all the teams, that everybody is getting a fair piece of the pie, regardless if you're Mercedes and Ferrari at the top, or if you're one of the smaller teams like a Sauber or Force India somewhere down at the bottom. And by all means, if Ferrari can negotiate something where they're unique and their historical position in Formula One is recognized, and they get a golden handshake, as it were, as recognition in the form of money, then sure, more power to them. I guess it goes back to that old saying that when it comes to looking for a job, it's not what you're worth, it's what you negotiate. And I guess Formula One really isn't all that much different. All right, well, let's kind of bring it back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, and this was interesting too. This kind of goes back to what we were talking about off the top of the show about the matchup between Charles Leclerc and Sebastian Vettel for 2019. And former Ferrari test driver Luciano Berti believes that Ferrari didn't do enough to really help ease the pressure and get Sebastian back into some good headspace last year. I mean, I think that just going back and looking at it, it's I don't think you need to be a psychologist or or anybody like that to really. I think it's a pretty fair observation to say that the pressure got to him and he cracked, and the I don't know what it is, the pressure of trying to beat Lewis or the pressure of being at Ferrari, the pressure of all of the above is really what got to them. But it was, there were so many incidents, like I say, but that's one of those things, right? I think when it comes down to professional sports of any kind, is just if you're a coach or a manager or a team principal of a Formula One team, how do you manage these athletes, these drivers, these people you have going out there and doing the hard work, like on the field of play, on the track? How do you manage those people, and how do you get them focused when they're down, and how do you keep them from getting too pumped up when things are going good, and really balancing them out? And that psychological part of professional, well, all sports, but especially top level and elite level sports like Formula One, I've always found that mental aspect of it quite fascinating. I mean, you can kind of go back to what we were talking about, Michael Schumacher. I mean, he was one of those guys too that just always seemed like he was completely flawless, and Lewis Hamilton's like one of those guys too, and it just seems that if you were going to be one of these guys that are trying to compete and try and beat a Lewis Hamilton or a Senna or a Schumacher, I mean, though you're going up against the alpha dogs there, you're going up against the big boys, and Nico Rosberg even talked about just the how much pressure he was under, and once you let Lewis Hamilton get inside of your head, or you think you've let him inside your head, like once you start losing that mental battle with a guy like Lewis Hamilton, then you're really doomed. But definitely, I think that Bertie really puts out throws out an interesting question there. And could Ferrari have done more to help Sebastian Vettel? Because when you kind of look back at all these different things, you can take Baku out of the equation. You can take that first lap incident at the French Grand Prix between Vettel and Bottas at the first corner where they both tangled, and he ended up getting the the time penalty as well. So, I mean, you can take like those isolated incidents out here and there, because those things are going to happen along the way too. I mean, would you, if you're Lewis Hamilton, would you have expected your car to fail when your team's leading 1-2 at the Austrian Grand Prix, and then you have a double DNF? I mean, these things are going to happen from time to time, but it was really, I think, at the German Grand Prix when Vettel was out there leading by quite a substantial margin, and then we got some spotty rain later in the race, and then he put it off into the gravel in the stadium section, and that really, I think, was the start of the real slide. They weren't competitive. They couldn't keep up and get around Bottas at the Hungarian Grand Prix the next week before the summer break, and well, it really was a bit of a flash in the pan, because after they had the summer break, they came back and Vettel had a great race. I thought Ferrari looked phenomenal at Spa, at the Belgian Grand Prix at the end of August, and I kind of thought, well, they kind of had a couple of hiccups here just going into the summer break, but maybe this is when we see Ferrari turn it around and really ratchet up the pressure and really make a push to win a championship this year. And then, of course, you get to Monza a couple of weeks later, and there's that bit of I don't know, tactical blunder that they made where Raikkonen actually got the faster time and sneaks the pole away from Sebastian Vettel, and then Vettel tangling with Lewis on the opening lap, and that for me was really the where it all really started to come apart at the seams there. And then, well, just take your pick from there. It really kind of added on and kind of went from bad to worse there on out. Anyways, well, let's see. Do we have anything else, or are we getting pretty close to the end? Well, I think that's a pretty good place to leave it for this week. I actually hadn't realized that there was so much stuff to talk about, and as I look here on my laptop, I see that we're already coming up on 50 minutes, so that seems like a very good place to leave it for now. And again, thank you for sticking with us. The show is doing well. It's growing each and every month. We're growing so much, in fact, that well, the numbers are staying the same, but in terms of listens and downloads. But to me, if the numbers are the same in around Christmas and New Year's as they are during the year when the Formula One is racing, then that just means that the listenership is up, and that some people have taken some time off, and hopefully will return once Formula One gets serious again in a couple of months, once testing starts, and of course the season starts. So again, thank you all very much for your support. Look forward to covering this season again, which will be our 4th season. I think we're coming up on our 100th episode somewhere in the next couple of weeks, so that's very exciting. And of course, if you want to get in touch with me or with Kevin, send us a tweet at Scuderia F1 Pod. Follow us on or follow our Facebook page, and that's facebook.com/Scuderia F1 Pod. And you can also send us an email if you're into that, scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com. And that's it. That's a wrap. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll catch you again and talk to you guys next week.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to ScuderiaF1pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at ScuderiaF1pod@gmail.com.
You were listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network. Visit us, sportspodcastingnetwork.com.